You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining this special edition of the American Revolution. Our guest earlier this month was author Jack Kelly, who came to our roundtable to discuss his new book, Tom Paine's War. Our American Revolution Roundtable learned about Tom Paine's actions in 1775 and 1776, before, during, and after the 10 crucial days of the war. One quick note, we recorded our discussion on Zoom. Our guest's audio had some issues which did have an impact on sound quality. Sorry for that. Hey, thanks everyone for joining the American Revolution podcast. We're at our roundtable tonight with author Jack Kelly, who has a new book coming out called Tom Paine's War. Hopefully everybody knows who Tom Paine is, sometimes called the propagandist of the war. What people may not know is that he actually fought as a soldier in a few months of the early part of the war, and that helped define some of his later writings. Jack, thanks for joining us today on the American Revolution podcast.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here, and thanks to everyone for tuning in.
Well, I guess we should start out with a little bit of an introduction as to who Tom Paine was. I guess we all know him from Common Sense. It seems to me if you ask people what the first few words of Common Sense are, 99% of them will say, "These are the times that try men's souls," which of course is wrong. That comes from a later work, which we'll also get into tonight, called The Crisis, which were probably two of Paine's most well-known works from the American Revolution. So where does your book start with Tom Paine?
Well, I have written a couple of books about the Revolutionary War, and I wanted to do a book that was more about what they were fighting for and still keep the war into it. And I thought Tom Paine would be a good candidate because he, as you mentioned, wrote two of the most important documents of the early part of the war, and he marched with Washington's army in what was really one of the most suspenseful and most violent campaigns in the latter part of 1776. So it was a mix of both. So that was my intro into Thomas Paine. My book is not a biography of him, but it does go back into his background a little bit. And a lot of people know he was from England. He was a recent immigrant to America when the Revolutionary War started.
Mm-hmm.
And I think probably the most important single aspect of him was that he was a working man. He was from a working class family. His father was a corset maker. And I know some people do tend to snicker about a corset maker, but it was a very respectable profession. And it was, the corsets were worn by everybody, and it was not a particularly profitable profession to be in. It was a lot of hard work. And he only had an elementary school education. That's all his family could provide for him. And then he became an apprentice to his father, and he worked, learned the trade, working 14-hour days, and then went out on his own as a corset maker when he came of age. And he worked all his life up until the time he came over to America. He had worked as a school teacher. He eventually got a job as a tax collector. Coming from a working class background, he drew more on his life experience than on just book knowledge for his ideas and for just his perspective on the world.
Yeah, and he actually had a lot of trouble with authority even before he left England. He was not somebody who just went along with things.
Well, he said that for the tax collectors were poorly paid, and he was in a sort of proto union trying to get a raise for the other excise men, they call them. And he said they were poorly paid, and therefore they were susceptible to bribery. And then he went out and proved that was the case because he accepted bribes himself. He said that's the only way they could get by.
Yeah.
And so he was fired actually twice from his job as a tax collector, and finally just decided to come over to America. And he knew Benjamin Franklin, who had been in London for a number of years at that point. They had some connection. Exactly how much is not really clear, but it was enough that Benjamin Franklin gave him a recommendation when he came to America.
Yeah.
So then he came to Philadelphia. He got a job as a magazine editor, which was another profession, new profession for him. got in with a lot of the people in Philadelphia. He loved Philadelphia, loved the taverns and the coffee houses, and he got to know pretty much everybody. He was a very congenial type of guy, and he was writing this magazine, so he made connections that way. So his friends that knew that he had the skill as a writer told him that he should write a pamphlet that would explain the conflict between Britain and America from an Englishman's point of view. So Paine took on that. They told him, and Benjamin Rush, who was a good friend of his, who was a doctor in Philadelphia, he said, just don't go too far. Don't mention the word independence. And of course, even with the war going on, this was in the fall of 1775, most people in America did not believe that they were fighting for independence. They wanted reconciliation under better terms. That was the whole point of the struggle.
The argument up until that time was we want to protect our rights as Englishmen to what they were
under the English Constitution. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Paine ignored that advice, and he wrote a very strong argument for independence, and that was the whole thrust of Common Sense.
Even went beyond independence, though. It basically said monarchy is a stupid idea for any country.
Well, that was it. He kept going farther and farther. First, he said there's some good reasons why we should be independent. Then he said the king. He said the king is a worm who, in the midst of his splendor, is crumbling into dust. So, and hereditary aristocracy is an insult. Then he said, and it's not just getting rid of the King of England. We should get rid of kings all over the world. We have it in our power to make the world over again. Very radical document, and surprisingly, it just changed public opinion almost 180 degrees overnight. And it was the huge bestseller. People read it everywhere, talked about it, and many people just said, yes, he's right. The king is a fraud. There's no divine right to rule us, and we can rule ourselves.
I know Paine gets a lot of credit for changing public opinion in a big way, and he certainly played a big role in that. I think he was also the beneficiary of really good timing, because about the time that Common Sense came out, word came from Britain that the king had called on Parliament to crush the rebellion by military force and that there would be no compromise. So I think the king's action, combined with the ideology of Paine, really helped move public opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it was the day before Common Sense was published, they got the copy of the King's speech in which he made all these derogatory remarks about the colonies, and said he was going to send an army over. That was just fortuitous for Paine. But I think Paine also had a sense of what was going on in the country, even though he was a relative newcomer, of what the feeling was underneath the surface of the colonists.
Yeah, and I think his writing style had a real impact as well. You read a lot of, pamphlets were a dime a dozen in 1774, 75, and early 76. But most of them were written by lawyers. They were very lawyerly and arguing, and Paine really came across as more of a, as you said, working man, common sense, plain language. This is just stupid. Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
That kind of
Yeah, that's definitely, one of the things that influenced Paine when he was in England, he used to engage in tavern debates. They would have these actual debates in taverns, or drinking pints of ale and going over issues of the day. And they gave a prize for whoever had the sharpest arguments, and Paine won the prize because he was able to talk to people in a way that made it very clear. His arguments were very clear. And he used that skill, I think, then later when he was writing the magazine, and then when he was writing his pamphlets himself. He didn't include a lot of quotes from the classics in his pamphlets.
Paine publishes Common Sense in January of 1776. We're coming up right on the 250th anniversary of that release in next month. And why don't you tell us a little about how it was received? I think we've talked about that already, but
he said that he figured it sold about 500,000 copies, but I think scholars have gone into that and found it was almost impossible they could have even printed that many. But 100,000, 150,000 copies in those days, I mean, even today, that's a huge bestseller. So It was widely read. It was printed in newspapers. There were pirated editions of it, and people talked about it, and it just swept the colonies. One thing he advised at the end of Common Sense was he said the best thing to do is to issue a Declaration of Independence. And between January, when he published that statement, and 6 months later, the Congress agreed. During that time, Paine was working behind the scenes, as were many others, to shift Congress to that opinion. It wasn't just people's opinions change and then Congress went along with it. There was a lot of effort that had to be made. Pennsylvania, in particular, had a pretty conservative government at the time, and Paine and others helped to push them to a more radical government. Once they went for independence, they brought along Maryland and other colonies that were on the fence. That was the trajectory that came out of Common Sense.
Was Paine publishing more stuff in the months after Common Sense, or was he mostly just going around lobbying and talking to people?
He had what were called the Forester letters that were an answer. A big debate, of course, arose in the pamphlet world and letters to newspapers about Common Sense, and he tried to answer all the objections and to maintain his position against these people who were critical of him. He was writing as necessary to counter those people.
And did he have any particular allies that he was working with at this time, or was it more of just putting out whatever he thought about as kind of a lone wolf?
Well, I think in Philadelphia, Benjamin Rush was probably his closest ally, and he was connected, I believe, and I'm trying to think of what the timing was, but I think Franklin actually came back from England during that time.
Yeah.
And so he would have been in his, he was got to be quite close to Franklin and would have been a huge ally for him.
And he was a very early, Paine was a very early advocate of abolition of slavery as well, even at this time, right?
It's not really clear whether he wrote actual abolitionist letters and articles, but he certainly published them in the magazine, edited them, and published them. And that was how he met Benjamin Rush. Rush was also an abolitionist and was very taken by the fact that Thomas Paine had this idea that was considered pretty out there at the time, freeing the slaves or getting rid of slavery.
Yeah, he always seemed to be a little ahead of the curve. It's probably not a coincidence that Rush and Franklin were two of the leading abolitionists by the later part of the war.
Yeah, and one thing that I found interesting too was that Paine was one of the few patriots that talked about India and what the British were doing in India, and because he had this worldview of undermining the British Empire. Of course, the British had at least the East India Company had been responsible for a huge famine in Bengal. I think 10 million people died in the early 1770s. So it was a pretty graphic illustration of what the British were up to.
Yeah, that became a big story even in America, the whole Bengal famine, because obviously it led later to the Tea Act, which became of particular interest in America. I think a lot of people saw India as a cautionary tale. It was a place where Britain had basically forced the locals to live at basically bare subsistence with no safety net whatsoever. And when hard times came along, there was nothing to do but die, starve to death, because Britain was essentially extracting all the wealth of the country out every year and taking it back to England. And a lot of Americans thought they could do the same thing in the American colonies, given a few years, if they're not facing resistance.
And they had the example of Ireland as well.
Ireland was another good example of the same thing. The empire extracts whatever it can from the colonies, and people are barely making it in good times. And if bad times happen, look out, it's all over. Yeah, so Thomas Paine had established himself as an effective opinion leader, I guess we'd call it, at the time, leading up to the Declaration of Independence. What did he do next?
After the Declaration was finalized, he immediately joined up with the Pennsylvania militia as a private, which I think was pretty remarkable action for somebody who was suddenly a celebrity. He was known all over, and even in Europe, his name was circulating around. But he decided he'd already given up all the profits for Common Sense to buy supplies for the army, and now he joined up as a private in what were called the Associators,
Yeah.
and that was a militia unit that had originated with Benjamin Franklin several decades earlier to try to come up with a way to get a militia in Pennsylvania when there were so many Quakers who were pacifists. So it was very voluntary. It was democratic. They elected their own officers and very short enlistments. And Paine sort of saw it as a school of democracy. Militarily, it was not the greatest idea. It was something that it gave Paine a feel for the ordinary men, for the enlisted men. And he was able to go back and forth over that divide that is in any military between enlisted men and officers. So he really had a unique view of the American military during that period of 1776.
Yeah, and it showed that Paine was not just going to talk the talk, he was also going to walk the walk, joining as
Yeah,
a volunteer with the Pennsylvania Associators, who were not just sitting around protecting Pennsylvania at the time, they were marching up to New York to confront what everyone knew was going to happen with the British invasion there.
yeah. He was actually sent to Perth Amboy, so they had really a front row seat on the buildup. The British were landing in Staten Island, which was just across the water there, and they could see the ships coming and see them unloading the troops and the supplies, and all during the summer of 1776.
Yeah, the British invasion was a very slow process, and certainly by modern standards. It took them months to get everybody on Staten Island and arrange everything and organize their troops before they actually hit Long Island and start the actual combat. So yeah, the Tom Paine and all the other Americans were just kind of sitting around watching this for months. And I think there was an intimidation factor there. The British were trying to
Yeah.
show the full might of British power and hope that they might be able to get some sort of surrender before there was even much combat. Yeah, Bob Wong is asking about Paine was obviously a very articulate, well-spoken person for the cause and for whatever cause he fought it. Do you know much about his early education and whether he
Well,
had?
he was his parents really could only afford to give him an elementary school education, so he was in school up to 12 years old as a sort of it was almost like a trade school. They learned arithmetic and things that they would need to run a business. And so he was basically self-educated all his life. He was a great studier. He took ideas from a lot of different people. He wasn't really a great original thinker, but I think he borrowed from a lot of the reading he did. He claimed he had not read John Locke, but many of his ideas seemed to be very closely aligned with the rule of the by consent that Locke had put out, and he was certainly over the years became very well versed in all the Enlightenment thinkers.
I'd guess that he learned a lot of it secondhand. He doesn't strike me as somebody who read a lot of the classical. He certainly didn't cite classical writers in a lot of his writing, but he probably argued and debated with a lot of people who had read those classics.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And as I said at the outset, I think he drew on his life experience as much as, just what was common sense is a pretty vacuous term when you really think about it, because it's like the flat earth was common sense at one point. But for Paine, it did fit with him because he had a feel for common people, and he would reduce things down to so that they can understand him. And I think he thought about things that way, just in simple, direct terms.
At some point in his military service, he ended up working for General Nathaniel Greene. Is that right?
Yeah, after the enlistments ran out for the Associators, I think in September, he moved up to Fort Lee. Nathaniel Greene was in charge of Fort Lee and Fort Fort Washington, directly across the Hudson River, and he stayed there and he would dine with the top officers, somebody like General Greene, at the same time, he knew the men in the enlisted ranks. So they think now that he was doing a little bit of sideline reporting. Some of the articles that appeared in newspapers about different battles may have been written by Thomas Paine. There's suspected that they were, and he would be sent out to see about the Battle of White Plains, and he would send back a dispatch to the newspapers what had happened, which really made him one of the first combat correspondents in American history.
He wasn't in the Continental Army, he was an associator, but he was with the Continental Army during this very difficult period where the British very quickly took New York, took New Jersey, pushed the Americans back across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. And at that point, everybody thought it's pretty much over. In fact, George Washington wrote to somebody, the game is pretty well up, or something to that effect.
Right.
Most of the very few soldiers who were still sticking with the army were mostly waiting for January 1st when their enlistments were up and they could get out of there so they wouldn't actually have to surrender as a soldier when this whole thing went kaplooey. There were still a lot of people who really believed in the cause, and certainly Thomas Paine was one of them. And he turned back to writing to kind of get the public back on track towards keeping up the resistance. And that, of course, is the crisis.
Yeah, he had been taking notes all during the campaign. He's always said to be writing on a drumhead, which I think was just a fanciful idea. After they got down to Pennsylvania, he left the army, went into Philadelphia, wrote this, what he called the American crisis at that time, and found a printer for it, which was not easy because a lot of people were leaving Philadelphia. Congress had already left. And he got it printed, and it was another bestseller that sold many, many copies of it. It was circulated through the army. It was circulated among civilians, and it was really an attempt. It was a rallying cry. It was not so much an argument as it was just, we can prevail. Don't be afraid. He tried to shame the loyalists, and of course, it began with his most famous words: "These are the times that try men's souls."
Sure.
And it was very effective. Exactly how it changed things then is almost impossible to say exactly. But I often look at history as almost like less like a row of dominoes with one thing causing another, but more like a flywheel where you get the flywheel, something gets it in motion, and then more and more influences speed it up. And I think that the American crisis was gave a very important momentum to that whole movement. But there were also new militia units coming in. There was a sort of an uptick in enthusiasm among the militia in Western New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And I always say the most important audience for the American crisis was George Washington himself. He needed to be bucked up. If he didn't read it, at least he knew in pretty good detail about it. And he was trying to make that decision. And it was a risky decision. Should we counterattack? Do we have the capability to do that? And he did make the decision 6 days after the publication of The American Crisis. They crossed the Delaware River back into New Jersey and marched down to Trenton and defeated the Hessians and really changed the war around.
Sure. Yeah, we all know that as the 10 crucial days, those 10 days that resulted from America pretty much looking like a guaranteed loser to being back in the game.
Yeah, that was, and I always put an emphasis too on the Second Battle of Trenton, which was about a week later, with after January 1st, where Washington had to beg his men to reenlist, and he got enough men reenlisted and stood up against the British and the Hessian armies then, and fought them to a standstill, and then very cleverly slipped away in the night and attacked the rear guard at Princeton, and was able to make it up to Morristown and get secure quarters up there. So it was, they call the Battle of Saratoga the turning point of the war, but I think that campaign, that counterattack, was really one of the huge turning points of the war.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah, he essentially gave the Americans public the impression that they had retaken New Jersey, which they pretty much had, and
Yeah.
that this General Howe came to New York trying to fight a war that they would never lose a battle. They would show that the British were indestructible, they could not be defeated, and that all resistance is futile. Washington's success in New Jersey showed them that resistance was certainly possible.
And I think a lot of people feel that it really changed Washington, that one victory. He became a little more bold, a little more less tentative in his decisions than he had been during the campaign before that. And of course, another factor in that, which was the capture of Charles Lee a few days earlier, had gotten rid of a sticky problem for Washington that Lee was more knowledgeable than he was, and he always had to have Lee looking over his shoulder. And now Lee had been captured by the British, so he didn't have to worry about him anymore.
The capture of Lee was seen as a disaster by the Americans and a huge victory by the British, but I think I agree with you that it was the best thing that could have happened to Washington in hindsight.
Yeah,
So Thomas Paine's war service pretty much ends with him leaving the army in December of 1776 and going off to write the crisis in Philadelphia.
yeah. He had a brief collusion with Nathaniel Greene during the campaign around Philadelphia in 1777.
Okay.
Not really involved in too much action, but he did act as an aide there for a while again. In the Continental Army, he was almost a volunteer. So, like other volunteers in the office, there were people who were could have been an officer, were not an officer. They were gentlemen, but they were just volunteering to do whatever was useful to doing. And I think Paine was quite useful the time he was in the military because all the orders, of course, were written and had multiple copies had to be written and distributed. And so they could use somebody like him who could write clearly and knew how to use language. And so was most of his job was communications and writing out orders.
Right. And he wrote a whole bunch of the crisis series, right, throughout the rest of the war.
Yeah, throughout the war, he continued to address different aspects of the war and try to buck up morale when it was needed. I think there were 16 different essays he wrote throughout the war. While serving in different government positions, he was an envoy to Native Americans for a while. He was in a foreign service. He went over to France as a representative. So he was kept busy and did his bit.
That's pretty much where your book ends, right? You do give a kind of
Yeah,
three.
I mean, I have a quick roundup of what happened to him later. The rest of his life was very event filled, and a lot of what people know about Thomas Paine was from his great debate with Edmund Burke and the French Revolution and all the controversy that he stirred up and was involved in. He almost went to the guillotine. He was in a dungeon for a while. He wasn't a big factor in the 1790s.
So yeah, he was over in France fighting. He was actually a member of the Assembly in the French Revolution for a while, and then he, of course, got caught up in the Reign of Terror and kind of barely got out of there with his neck. And he ended up coming back to America for the end of his life.
Right.
Yeah.
He had been given a farm up in New Rochelle by New York that they'd taken from some loyalists, and he retired there. He used to go back and forth from New York City up to New Rochelle. Um, he was very much tied in with Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's enemies used Thomas Paine as a weight around his neck. They call him the two Toms because Thomas Paine was so, his reputation had gone down so far. Jefferson, though he kept him a little bit at arm's length, he was very cordial to him and invited him to come back. And they saw, had a meeting of the minds on many, many issues.
Yeah, I'd probably describe Paine at that point as the Zoran Mondami of his time. He was the radical boogeyman that the right loved to attack and make fun of.
Yeah.
think that he was going to destroy America. Yeah, it was an interesting end to a life, but he really was a radical's radical. I mean, he was one of the first people to talk about implementing Social Security, for example, that
Exactly. Yeah.
happened for another nearly two.
Very much ahead of his time, even ahead of our times, I'd have to say, Thomas Paine. And he did another drag on his reputation was he did criticize George Washington. When he was in a dungeon in France, he felt that Washington, as president now, was not doing enough to get him out, and he decided to write on a sort of out of pique. He decided to write Washington a letter, and he criticized not only that he not help get him out of the dungeon, but he was never even a very good general. He said, which was not only not true, but it was totally contradictory what Paine had said many times during the Revolution, what a great general Washington was. Washington never answered the letter, and he didn't live much longer. So
Yeah,
he was dead by the time Paine got back.
certainly did not help Paine's reputation because by that point, Washington was a demigod in the American.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah, so yeah, he is a fascinating guy, and I've read several biographies of him, and this one is obviously this isn't a biography; it covers a very specific, fixed point in Paine's life, but he is an interesting character throughout his entire life. Somebody who just really didn't fit a lot of molds, but was basically somebody who was very forward looking, was really not constrained by the conventional wisdom of the time, and really was a opinion changer throughout his life.
I always liked the fact that he was a great optimist, and he was always upbeat. And when I say I have called him the founder for our time, and I think that's part of it was just that congenial spirit that he had, and everything. And he said, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again." And he always believed that. It was not just rhetoric. So I think that was is something we could use today is to believe we could get things going, change the world.
Absolutely. So I'm going to open it up for questions now. If anybody has a question, either jump in or you can raise your hand, however you want to do it. David, I know you put a question in the.
Yeah. Do you want to read it, Mike, or do you want me to?
Why don't you go ahead and put it in your own words?
All right. It's so long. Hi, Jack. I want to thank you for writing the book, which I've ordered, and I'm especially looking forward to reading it, and in particular, your account of the Assunpink Creek battle, which Roger Williams told me he really loved. So, and that's a subject that's near and dear to my keyboard. But the question I had, which I hope you can maybe shed some light on, is that I read the other day, and I don't remember where, but that at the end of the war, Paine said something to the effect that it was a wonder. That's his word, wonder, the outcome. I thought that was kind of odd because my impression is that pretty much everything he wrote in the pamphlets during that time expressed a relentless optimism about the odds of the rebellion succeeding, or at least basically saying there was no way the British could win. An island can't conquer a continent, that sort of thing. Assuming that we're to take him at his word, that he really believed that, then I'm sort of curious as to why he would express wonderment at the outcome rather than saying something like, I told you so. And maybe he did, and I just didn't read it. So I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with exactly that phrase that you're citing there, and I think it may have been somewhat in the area of rhetoric. That George Washington said it was nothing short of a miracle that we won, were able to sustain the revolution and win. And to
Right.
say it's a wonder might have just meant, it was wonderful, or it was an amazing accomplishment, and not really meaning to say I never thought we would win. From everything that Paine wrote throughout the war, he really did have confidence, and he expressed confidence, but I think he really felt confidence that they. And I think he had a great insights into American character and the patriot sort of zeitgeist, that what they were thinking, and was able to tap into that and based his optimism on something that was really solid.
Bob, do you have a question?
Yes, the question I have is, what was the reaction to Common Sense and the American Crisis by France and also by England? So, for example, with the Declaration of Independence, there were rebuttals and denigration of the Declaration of Independence that were written by English writers. What was the reaction to these documents from England and France?
The reaction to Common Sense and the American Crisis?
Yes.
That's a good question. I have to say I'm not really sure what the British were thinking, but I assume that they were pretty irate about it, Common Sense in particular.
Yeah, I know George
And
had been saying for years that the Americans are talking about reform, but what they really want is independence. I have to think when he saw Thomas Paine's work, he must have been saying, "Yeah, see, I told you so."
it was in a certain way, it was taking the gloves off on both sides. It was not.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that Thomas Paine later said, he said, if it had just been about independence, it wouldn't have meant anything. It was the establishment of a new form of government, a new government of the people, a republic, that was the important part. Because he said if it was just breaking away from England, it wouldn't have mattered. Now he didn't say that at the time, but that's what he said in retrospect. So the one thing that he wrote that was very most annoying to the British was rights of man. And Edmund Burke had criticized the French Revolution very early on in the French Revolution, and Paine was then very enthusiastic for the revolution. And it was quite amazing. Here's somebody with an elementary school education going up against one of the great intellectuals in British society at the time, member of Parliament, and went toe to toe with Burke and argued back and forth as to what the basic principles were involved, and who was right about both the French Revolution and, as Paine said, you should have a similar revolution in Britain. For that, he was condemned, and one of the reasons he stayed in France for years afterwards was he was afraid to get on a ship and come to America, because if he'd been caught by the British, then at war with France, he would have been hanged. So he never went back to his homeland, his original homeland again.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you haven't read the debates between Burke and Paine during that time, it really is the back and forth and the various pamphlets and stuff is really interesting stuff. It's basically, should we continue with monarchy and reform it, or should we create a new world order, which is based on justice and liberty? And yeah, it's really interesting. Anybody else? All right, well, Jack, why don't you tell us when's your book coming out? It's right around the anniversary of Common Sense, I believe.
It'll be published on January 6th, and January 10th is the 250th anniversary of the publication of Common Sense, and I'm very hopeful that my book will sell as many copies as Common Sense did.
There you go. Yeah, it is available for pre-order now. It's a great read. I was lucky enough to get an advance copy. Very much enjoyed it. I'm sure you guys will too.
I had a lot of fun writing it. It was putting Thomas Paine within that context of that very exciting period of the Revolutionary War and the very consequential period.
Yeah, and his whole war experience is something we don't really think much about Paine. We think about him as a writer and an idealist and things like that, but to actually be a soldier out there in the battlefield was kind of an interesting emphasis on his life. I almost hate asking authors this because they probably feel so relieved to have the book completed and out there and done. What are you working on next?
I've been juggling different ideas. That's all I can say. I'm put a lot of time into trying to promote this book, and
Absolutely.
whether I'm sort of in the position you're in is, do I move forward into the early republic, or do I stick with the Revolutionary War? And I don't know. I'm not sure yet if I'm going to try to continue, different aspects of American history or just stick with the war. But I've written quite a bit about the revolution, and I'm mainly interested in characters. So when I latch onto a character that I like and that it has an interesting story, that's usually decides it for me.
Sounds good. Well, we look forward to it. Yeah, Jack Kelly, your new book, Tom Paine's War, as you say, is coming out on January 6th. You can pre-order it today. It's a great read. I hope everyone enjoys it. And certainly thank you for joining us on the American Revolution podcast.
Thank you, Mike. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks again to author Jack Kelly, who joined us to discuss the subject of his new book, Tom Paine's War. The book is available for purchase on January 6, 2026, right around the 250th anniversary of Thomas Paine's publication of Common Sense. I've included links on my blog and in the show notes if you want to buy either the book or the audiobook. Using links I've provided there helps support this podcast, since Amazon will pay a small commission on your purchase. If you would like to participate in future discussions, be sure to add your email address to my mailing list on MailChimp or join on Patreon, even as a free member. These are where I post links to upcoming discussions. You can join the mailing list or Patreon using the links provided in the show notes. Thanks again for joining us on the American Revolution podcast.